We took the bus at London Blue. "Hey, Addie, it's our song!" Kurt spoke loudly so she could hear him over the music and crowd. Adeline smiled and nodded, raising her brows. She began to wiggle her shoulders and bounce in place, as the room was so packed with people there wasn't much space to dance. The enormous speakers in the corners blared, "Domo arigato, Mr. Roboto, domo, domo." It's an odd one for a couple to claim as their song. However, they discovered they were both at the Styx concert at the same time and didn't know it. It was actually the first concert either of them had ever attended, and over the years, they enjoyed keeping track of their firsts together. Adeline leaned in and whispered in Kurt's ear, "Would you like to bring in the new year someplace more quiet?" "Of course. But what about our DD? I'd feel bad leaving him in a club by himself." "Have you not seen Josh? He's not exactly alone." They both looked toward the end of the bar and saw Josh talking to two women, one on each side. Kurt smiled. "Okay, but I can't drive." "We'll take the bus. I think there's one that runs by here in 5 minutes," Adeline replied. "Well, I'm in. Let's go." Instead of fighting the crowd to get to Josh, Adeline sent him a text telling of their plan to leave. After Josh gave her a thumbs up from across the room, she and Kurt put on their coats and walked outside. The air was crisp and moist, with tiny flakes of snow starting to fall. Kurt wrapped his arms around her waist from behind. "I'm surprised you wanted to leave the big throwback New Year's party," he said. She tipped her head to the side, twisting her face toward him. "I have other ideas to celebrate." The bus pulled up to the side of the curb. Black smoke shot out from behind as the air brakes sighed. The bifold door opened, revealing a large woman sitting in the driver's seat. "Well, come on now if you're coming. It's cold out there and we have a schedule to keep," the driver said with a smile. Kurt squinted to focus in on the driver's name posted over her head. "Mildred Johnson," the sign read. Mildred was a robust and solid name, no doubt fit perfectly with the strong, lovely woman that was their chauffeur for the night, he thought. Adeline and Kurt climbed on board and paid the fare. She grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the back of the bus. It was nearly empty, with only 2 other passengers, one of which looked as if he had already passed out from drinking too much of the bottle propped up on the seat beside him, wrapped in a small brown paper bag. "Hurry up and sit yourselves down," the driver called out. Adeline shoved Kurt into the back seat and fell on his lap, giggling. "And we'll have none of that on this bus," Mildred said. "Hold on to your knickers. Here we go," she added with a chortle. The bus pulled out from the stop. The flakes became bigger, heavier, and more bountiful. The winds howled like wolves, and Adeline snuggled under Kurt's arm, with her long silver nails seductively squeezing into his thigh. "I've never rode on the bus before. How many stops until we get home?" Kurt asked Adeline. "Not many. I think there are typically 2 before the tunnel," she answered, and nuzzled closer into his chest, determined to receive some PDA. The bus drove to the end of a narrow holler. You big city folks call it a hollow. It took a few ins and outs before the bus made a complete 180 and then stopped. Before climbing off the bus, the plump driver announced, "We're actually ahead of schedule, so here we are with a smoke break. Burn 'em if you got 'em, but get off the bus first." Kurt, being a huge Merle Haggard fan, shouted out through the open doors, "We don't smoke or take trips on LSD. However, we'd be down for some white lightning. But better off if you just get us home while it's still New Year's Eve." "Okie from Muskogee," Mildred laughed, surprising Kurt that she recognized the reference to the old song. Kurt nodded with a smile. "Touché, my friend, touché, as I would much rather be at home drinking white lightning on New Year's Eve than driving you people around," Mildred answered. Kurt and Adeline laughed as she climbed back on the bus and took her designated driver's seat behind the wheel. "Well, let's get going," Mildred said, as she pulled the bus out of the head of the holler. She drove down the road and around the bend, then announced as the bus slowed, "Last stop before the tunnel." The woman sitting behind the driver rose. The man dozing with his bottle woke up and stood to his feet. Clinging to the back of the seat in front of him, he shouted, "That's me! I'm not going through that tunnel again." As the bus came to a stop, the two exited, and the man mumbled something under his breath. "My buddy never made it back from that tunnel last New Year's." Mildred closed the door and smiled. Looking back at Adeline and Kurt in the sizable rearview mirror, she said, "So, I guess it's just the three of us that are tunnel bound." "What's the deal with all the tunnel talk?" Kurt asked Adeline. Adeline shrugged and affectionately squeezed his thigh again. Kurt pulled out his phone and saw that it was 5 minutes until midnight. "We're going to be stuck on this stupid bus when the ball drops," he said, frustrated. "Well, that doesn't mean you can't still kiss me," Adeline replied with a grin. The bus was set back into motion, and a couple of quick minutes passed before they approached the tunnel entrance. It was an old, narrow hole hewn through the mountain from when the railroad was built. Shortly after the road was better established, the railroad employees began buying the land nearby to make their homes on. The property on the opposite side sold relatively cheaply back in the day, as people feared the tunnel would collapse. Many years later, a few apartment complexes were constructed, which is where Adeline and Kurt now live. They had traveled through the tunnel several times daily for years and never had any issues. That is until this night. As the bus rolled into the dark tunnel, Mildred slammed on the brakes, nearly throwing Adeline onto the floor. Kurt caught her and pulled her back up onto the seat. "What the?" Kurt yelled. Dark, shadowy figures swooshed back and forth across the headlights. Just as midnight struck, their cell phones began dinging and flashing like a 1970s disco ball. The tunnel walls began to spin, with cascading lights swirling about as if they had just entered one of those funhouse tunnels that make you lose your balance. However, the walls were actually moving, spinning, and dropping pieces of rock on top of the bus. The echo of the pounding debris hitting the bus imitated that of a metal-roofed barn in a severe hailstorm. A chunk of stone cast through the windshield, knocking Mildred unconscious while sending tiny bits of glass through the air. The wind screeched as it rocked the large passenger vehicle side to side. Adeline clung to Kurt with the strength of a death grip as she cried. Suddenly, the crown of the tunnel dropped, forcing the bus to crush through the ground where it sat. It was like a scene from Alice in Wonderland as the bus fell through a dark pit. The force raised Adeline and Kurt from their seats, and momentarily they were airborne. The bus landed, and they dropped onto the hard, rubber-lined floor, so hard it knocked the breath from both of them. After regaining their composure, Kurt ensured Adeline was okay and helped her back onto the seat. He then proceeded toward the front of the bus to check on Mildred, but she was gone. "She's not here!" Kurt yelled toward the back of the bus, where Adeline was looking through one of the windows. Kurt, where are we?" she asked in a nervous tone. She climbed out of the seat and rushed towards the front. Kurt pulled the lever to open the door. A gust of warm, dry air swept in, carrying the scent of a trash-yielding bonfire. He took her hand as they stepped off the bus and found themselves in a dark alleyway. Yet the front of the bus was facing a tall concrete wall. "What the?" she whispered. They walked around the back of the bus. Proceeding along the dirt-compacted path, they passed between two burning barrels. Each sat at the end corners of exceedingly high stone buildings that had created the alley. The road running perpendicular was made of brick and aligned with abandoned structures with caved-in roofs. There was not a soul in sight, but they could hear odd carnival-type music coming from afar. As they made their way down the road, a man jumped out from behind a large dead tree and yelled in a scruffy voice, "We got newbies!" "Hey, mister, where are we?" Kurt reluctantly asked. The man was dirty from his rounded toe boots to his filthy, soot-covered face and derby-style hat. He appeared as an old railroad hobo and was gnawing on what looked like a charred rat on a skewer. The man chuckled. "You, my friends, have just entered Calamity Corner of Smoke Hole Mountain." "Where is that?" Adeline asked. "It's nowhere and everywhere," the man replied, and took a bite of the hip of the cooked critter on a stick. As he pulled a burnt tiny foot from his teeth, he chuckled. "Let's get out of here," Kurt said, prodding Adeline down along the road. The man roared with a devilish laugh. "You cannot get out, you silly man!" Kurt and Adeline darted away as the man continued to yell. "You can never get out of Calamity Corner!" The end of the brick road dropped off onto a small knoll. At the bottom was an open, barren field with worn and tattered circus tents that must have been 100 years old. Nestled between the tents were makeshift wooden street vendor carts. Together, they formed an alley of their own. As Adeline and Kurt made their way down the small hill onto the dusty path, they were met by another man. He resembled the drunk man on the bus, but dressed in a black and gray striped clown suit, soiled with brown dirt stains. "Welcome to Calamity Row," the clown said as he stretched out his arm, pointing the way to the tents. "What is this place?" Adeline asked. "Why, my good lady, this place is where humanity meets its demise," he answered. The creepy black smile painted on his whitewashed face quickly melted into a frown. Mind your P's and Q's, my dear. Continue only with great caution. But please, do continue." The clown nodded. Kurt took Adeline's hand and pulled her along the pathway from the clown. To the left was a tent with faded red and yellow-stained white stripes. A burlesque-dressed woman was propped up on a flattened space on top of a vast mirrored ball. Her stringy black hair allowed bald patches of scabs on her scalp to be seen. She balanced herself with her hands as she rocked side to side on her legless hips. "Step inside. Take a peek at the most unusual erotica you'll ever see," the lady called out to them. Kurt hesitated and gawked. Adeline dug her long nails into his hand and yanked on his arm. "Ow!" Kurt shouted. The tent to the right was adorned with faded blue stripes. A man rushed out front from heavy curtains wearing a black torn suit with tails and a crushed top hat. He waved his cane and announced, "Come inside and discover oddities such as the mummified mountain corpse, a perfectly preserved severed head, the skeleton of the Ogwa, and much, much more." As they continued walking, the man angrily yelled, "Fine! I'll just wait a few days and add you two to the show." A line of vendor carts followed along both sides of the road. They were selling creepy items like critters on a stick. They were displayed sticking upright in an enormous burlap sack, possibly filled with sand, beside a blazing fire in an open brick oven. Another had cones wrapped with crusty cotton candy that had gotten damp, began to dissolve, and then dried. The next cart was selling what claimed to be food. Their products actually looked like meaty fingers wrapped in flour-covered dough with a sign that read, "Finger food. We cut 'em, you cook 'em." Directly beside that were a couple of long boards placed on top of cinder blocks stacked 3 high. The first section contained used, fingerless gloves for sale. The second half was full of just the finger sacks from used gloves, with a sign positioned in the center that read, "Keep your nubs or remaining digits warm. Buy 2, get 1 free." "I don't know what this place is, but we need to find Mildred and get home," Kurt said. "But what if we can't find her?" Adeline asked. "Then I'll drive the damn bus. This place is a creep show." A young man between 18 and maybe 22, wearing a long overcoat, approached them. He opened the sides of his coat to show the couple his collection of loosely stitched-in rings, bracelets, and necklaces. "Hello, my fine sir. Would you like to purchase the beautiful lady some jewels to adorn her lovely flesh while it's still fresh?" the man said with a sinister smile. "That's it!" Kurt yelled as he sucker-punched the young man. The man fell to the ground. Gently, as he rubbed his jaw, he said, "Now that was uncalled for. I was just trying to help you make the little woman feel special before she becomes—" Kurt kicked the man in the ribs and pulled Adeline around him. As they passed more tents and carts along the road, it ended at an entrance to an outdoor theater. Rows and rows of old, splintered wood picnic tables lined from the back entrance all the way up to the concrete stage area. It reminds me of something I would imagine from a food court in an apocalyptic amusement park, Adeline whispered to Kurt. I'm scared. Let's go back to the bus. We need to find Mildred. We can't just leave her in this nightmare, Kurt replied. 5 minutes, Adeline shouted. In 5 minutes, I'm going back to the bus. As they made their way weaving between the tables occupied here and there by other vendors, Adeline heard someone call her name. Addie! Addie! Over here! The man called out. Oh my gosh, it's Micah, Adeline said and rushed over to his table. You got cash, jewels, anything you may want to trade for some fruit? Micah eagerly asked. What's up with this place? Where are we? Adeline asked. So you just arrived. Well, I'll sell you a bag of 6 blood oranges for nearly nothing. How much do you have? Micah asked excitedly. Adeline nudged Kurt. Kurt pulled out his wallet and pilfered through it. He finally pulled out a $10 bill and asked, do you have change? Micah snatched the money from his hand and answered, That's actually a little short of the asking price, but since you're neighbors, I'll cut you a deal. He handed the paper bag of oranges to Adeline. How do we get home? She asked. Home? Darling, you are home now, he said with a smirk. How did you get here anyway? We took the bus, she answered. Then you can still get back home. Anyone who comes in on the bus can get back, Micah said. How? Kurt asked. You must first find your driver or another transporter to get the bus back. But you only have an hour from when you arrived, or you're stuck here like the rest of us. So we don't necessarily have to find Mildred then? Adeline asked. No, but transporters are rare and usually won't be bothered. You may check the burlesque house or the Saddle Me saloon, Micah replied. But you better hurry. Well, we're not going in the legless burlesque house. So where is the saloon? Adeline asked. Micah snickered. It's down beside the stage. Adeline grabbed Kurt by the shirt and headed toward the saloon. Snatching up the bag of oranges they paid $10 for, she waved at Micah and said thanks. She led the way, busting through the old Western style swinging doors, and announced, We're looking for Mildred. The crowd seated at small wobbly tables were made up of toothless and dirty men in apparel dating from the late 1800s to present day. A woman dressed as a barmaid from the Old West approached Adeline. She asked if they would like a drink. No, thank you. We're just trying to find our driver, Kurt interrupted to answer. The woman squeezed Adeline's hand, slipped her a note, and said, Your only hope. Then the woman walked away. Adeline turned her back to the crowd and read the note. Mildred was never here. Find Mick Wayne in the purple and orange tent. Adeline tugged on Kurt's arm, pulling him back outside. She showed him the note. I think that was beside the oddities tent, Kurt said. Let's go. They rushed back to the beginning of Calamity Row and found the purple and orange tent. This one stood quietly, Unlike the others, with large signs, displays, and someone to help wrangle people inside, only a tiny A-frame sign stood in front with a handwritten message that read, "Time Warp." Adeline and Kurt pulled back the heavy drape. They pushed inside as thick dust filled the air, stuck to their faces, and seeped into their lungs. They both coughed. "Hello?" Kurt called out into an empty entranceway, glowing blue. A tall, slender woman slowly appeared in front of the blue light. Her long white hair curled around her broad shoulders. "Looking for a time trip?" she asked with a deep voice. We're looking for Mick Wayne," Adeline answered in a soft voice. "I'm Mick," she said. She smiled at the confusion written on their faces, then said, "It's short for Michaela. Tell me, my dears, how did you get here?" "We took the bus," Kurt replied. "Ah, very well. Follow me. You must be almost out of time, so don't dawdle." Mick disappeared through another set of heavy curtains. Adeline and Kurt followed. The room was dark, with 2 blue seats attached to each other in the middle of the space. A strange purple light glowed from underneath, with a soft orange glow overhead, as if they were positioned purposefully under the warmth of a sunrise on a new day. "What have you brought to pay for your fare?" Mick asked. Kurt pulled out his wallet. Opening it carefully, he realized all was spent. Taken back by how pale his face turned, Adeline spoke up. "Blood oranges! We have brought you blood oranges!" She held the crumpled brown bag out to Mick. Mick took the bag and said, "Take your seats." They moved closer toward the chairs and then sat down. The brown bag finally gave way to a small rip in the bottom. The oranges fell to the ground. Adeline gasped when she saw the oranges had already been peeled and were starting to dry out and crack. Mick's green eyes turned as white as her hair. The ground began to tremble. Overwhelmed with fear, Adeline grabbed Kurt's arm and cried, "We didn't know! We didn't know they were peeled!" With a flip of Mick's extended finger, 2 oranges rolled under each seat. Mick flipped her right hand, and the other 4 rolled in a circle, each stopping to take its place on the 4 quadrants of a clock face that had lit up in red on the floor beneath them. Winds began to swirl the room, and the ticking of a clock began echoing in their ears. "Count it down. Starting now," Mick shouted. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, Adeline and Kurt counted while clinging to one another. Their chairs, caught up in a whirlwind, began to spin. The orange and purple and red lights swirled around them like laser beams from video games. Mick raised her arms and yelled, "Go back to where you came!" Everything stopped. The lights went out, and Mick vanished in a puff of smoke. Kurt held Adeline tight in the dark silence. Then they heard the air brakes on the bus and felt a jarring motion. A bright white light flickered and finally stayed on. Spots blurred their vision. They rubbed their eyes, trying to focus from the darkness to the light, when they heard the door open on the bus. Mildred appeared, clearly in the driver's seat and said, "Well, come on, you two. I believe this is your stop."